Namaste. All
This
these.
can be summed up this quick. If you can't walk the walk, don't talk the talk.
Okay, I'll turn off the
All
video.
right, you can go now. Next.
Well,
Realistically, though, did any of us really totally walk the walk?
All those 3 readings that they determined from the reading?
Mhm.
Very true.
It's your behavior, that's what you say. It's the
Don't
purity
be a
of,
Pharisee.
it's the purity of your own.
We hijacked your message.
no, you haven't. You're going after what could have been my message.
Oh, I'm so glad it's something else.
First of all, I should say that Theravadan or Theravadan, whichever you prefer, I use them both. Buddhism, the scriptures that they use were written in a language called Pali. The Mahayana Buddhists, which are your Zen Buddhists, your Tibetan Buddhists, the scriptures they use were translations of the Pali written in Sanskrit. And so you have word differences because the Pali likes to use B's instead of V's and M's instead of R's. So instead of having Dharma, you have Dhamma. Instead of having Nirvana, you have Nibbana. And so instead of having a sutra, you have a sutta. Because sometimes you just get rid of the R. And it can...
Speech impediments.
Yeah, well, they probably,
Boston. Didn't like their R's.
Boston, that could be. Or it could be like, well, no, it's people.
When you have one that's this complicated,
It's kind of-
make that the second reading.
It's kind of like going to a Chinese restaurant, you know?
Teddy's restaurant?
Chinese restaurant where they,
Chinese restaurant.
the R's and the L's and the ba ra 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 ra
I
ra
was
ra
just
ra.
going to do that, but I hate coffee.
Ramana.
So that can be confusing, but the other thing you should know is that Sanskrit really, it's so much easier to pronounce when you recognize or realize that there's never more than 2 or 3 letters in a syllable, and most syllables end with a vowel. So then when you get, where'd it go? There you go. On the next to last line on the first page.
Yeah.
Ta, tha, ga, ta, garba. Tatha, gata, garba. Because everything ends with that vowel. And it's very sort of staccato. And when we look at it, of course, we say, what a mess.
Buddha nature is just so much easier to say.
If Buddha nature is easier. Not to mention Visuddhimagga.
Okay.
Yeah. But I wanted to talk about purity, and Tracy missed my explanation of this. No, that's quite all right, because I'll do it again, and I'll hold it up for those of you at home. The Jewish concept of purity had a lot to do with the way things most often were. The normal state of things. And so I wanted to get a picture with like a compound fracture or a big hairy dislocation. But of all the things, you can bleed around me, you can puke around me, we can even open you up and look inside. But do not come to me with a dislocated part or a compound fracture. When things aren't where they belong, my world starts to spin and I get hot and so on. So I was looking for, first I Googled compound fracture, and then I realized I couldn't do that. So I just found an x-ray of a dislocation to remind me to talk about purity.
It's connected to tissue disorder.
Right. Well, no, but you're not like. I wanted to talk about the whole purity thing from the angle that we do tend to believe purity is behavior. At least traditionally we've been taught that. It's like the old joke, forgive me, how does a blonde turn on the lights after sex? She opens the car door.
Oh,
So, it is terrible. But that is an illustration of how traditional purity worked. It was like, first of all, it was very misogynistic, very patriarchal, and very much about what you did not about the attitude with which you did it. I won't even tell you what she says afterwards. Are you guys all on the same team?
Yeah.
Which again goes to purity, right? The traditional idea of purity, which brings me to the notion of purity balls, which are not, as you might expect, pure testicles. But this idea in the evangelical church, lest you think that Roman Catholics are the only sick ones, these twats have come up with this idea of a purity ball where you get a purity ring from daddy because you're giving your virginity to daddy to protect until you're married. And you have like a prom thing where you go with your daddy.
It's really
All
sick.
dressed in white.
Really sick.
It's really sick.
Yeah.
It's beyond sick. It's,
And the weirdest one is when the pregnant daughter gets up there and says,
well, yeah. Or she comes up to a friend and says, I'd like to introduce you to my uncle and father. And there's only one guy standing. So, how we understand purity needs to be changed for today. And, as time goes on, I become more and more disenchanted with contemporary translations of Scripture. And the reason that some of us like old stuffy translations is that they're more accurate. And even the changing of the position of a word. Pure and undefiled religion, well, they don't even do it right. This is how jacked up the last sentence in James is. True devotion, the kind that is pure and faultless before God the Father, is this. Was more accurately, true religion. I lost it. Damn it. There it is. Pure, undefiled religion in the eyes of God our Father is this. Coming to the help of orphans and widows when they need it, or in some of the older translations, in their distress, and keeping oneself uncontaminated by the world, which sounds like a subtle difference from keeping the world from contaminating us, but it's a huge difference. Because this idea of the world might contaminate us poses sort of this aggressive, nasty, naughty, dirty world that might try and put some schmutz on us, and so we have to watch out for it. And the idea, versus the idea, I think, in the more accurate translations of, there's stuff that goes on around you that you can get involved with that is a bad idea. But, and that does have a negative impact on you, but it is so far from being the sexual stuff that it isn't even funny. I mean, yes, we can make mistakes in the sexual arena, but the guy who claims to be sexually virtuous and monogamous and yet goes home and beats his wife has so much more of a purity problem than the pregnant teen that shows up at the purity ball. That it's just incomprehensible. And you pointed out correctly that Jesus probably never said sexual sins.
I like, they're real big on fornication, but I don't think Jesus ever said sex. Could be wrong.
I don't know. I don't know if the word exists in the Aramaic.
It's kind of like, with the whole, equal rights of marriage thing, the Marriage Equality Act.
Uh-huh.
When somebody was arguing that, Jesus said marriage is between a man and woman, and I was like, marriage wasn't the word, then it's a 17th century French.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Just for giggles, they're probably trying to get away from saying some words that they find to be impure. Fornication.
See? I knew it.
You hit the ball on.
Theft, murder, adultery, avarice, malice, deceit, indecency, envy, slander, pride, and folly.
See,
Describing
so
my
nothing
behavior.
that
Yeah, well, yeah.
Folly's
And I
my favorite. I know, right?
I thought-
Folly, what do you got?
Well, and I thought it was interesting. It says unrestrained immorality, so apparently bondage is all right.
Unrestrained.
Oh.
Yeah.
What does that mean, unrestrained?
I have no idea.
like immorality that you don't keep in integrity, basically.
It's so-
Think like The
yeah.
Purge, where everybody just goes and does what they
Yeah.
want with no restraint whatsoever.
But that's how
Yeah,
they.
offers and, yeah.
But that's how they translated indecency.
Sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
Yeah, that's my motto.
But are indecency and unrestrained morality the same things? I don't think so. Because you can be indecent in any number of ways, not just indecent exposure. For example, I had the grandkids. It was Grandpa's, I don't know what it was, week of
You look like you had fun.
filling in for daycare. Well, your pictures are deceiving. I mean, I did.
Yeah,
I
we
did.
put the good pictures on. Are they talking about Facebook?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was tiring, you know. And anyway, we're sitting at the park, and there's a playground in New Berlin. It's just great. I forget what it's called.
Well,
Yeah,
I saw the pictures.
yeah. Oh, yeah, I did. Yeah. Anyway, I was sitting at a picnic table in the shade while they were in the playground area, and Natalia came over and sat down, and some boy was walking along the sidewalk, and she turned around and noticed him, and he was kind of like zoning, staring at us. He's probably her age. She looks at him and goes, "What are you looking at?"
Yeah.
Not realizing that his father was over her other shoulder. And then she was, whoops. Okay, but that's indecency. I mean, really. That's the only indecency is not streaking or something like that. There's indecency in terms of how we treat each other. And the record, both scriptural and Eastern, both Western scriptures and Eastern, says that purity is about how we treat one another. It's not about perfection. It's not about, and this is nearly the same thing, but it's not about not making mistakes. It's not about doing everything that we set out to do without, any extra movement or motion or energy. It's about how we treat one another. And we're going to treat one another in such a way that we make mistakes. And that doesn't destroy purity. We sort of equated purity with virginity, physical virginity, and said that once it's broken, you're out of luck. Which is part of this conservative church and spiritual and religious movement that says, we need to make you, people, dependent on us, the institution. And so, we'll set up a bunch of situations and circumstances where the only way you can be made whole again is to come through us. Because that's good for business. And so, total depravity, Calvinism is one. But this notion of purity is one. Well, you're impure. And what we separate it from is that biblical idea, again, that purity was when things were where they were supposed to be. So, and there was purity in terms of worship, ritual, what made you pure enough to enter the temple, which had nothing, well, virtually nothing to do with sexuality. And then there was purity in the moral sense. But think of temple purity as like in the old days when women had to have a chapel veil on their head to go into church. It was that kind of stuff, no shoes, no shirt, no surface. And what a lot of folks do who misinterpret all this is they look at that stuff, the no shirt, no shoes, no service.
They don't say anything about pants.
Well,
I did that in Florida once.
I think that's understood.
I did that in Florida once because I was coming from the beach, so I had my swimsuit bottom on, and just for shits and giggles, I had flip flops, a tank, no pants, and somebody tried to yell at me, and I was like, "Your sign says nothing about pants." I was a shit as a teenager.
Was, yeah. So how do we transform the culture? So, how do we get, pardon the expression, get off of this idea that the only thing that matters is what we do sexually, and transfer it to the idea that really underlies purity, which says that what really matters is how do we treat one another? Do we treat each other lovingly? Do we spend all our time judging each other? Do we grow beyond the mean girls phase of middle school, or the mean boys phase of middle? All the boys are different. They break each other.
It's like a game.
Yeah, they break each other down in a different sort of way. So,
I have an idea.
okay,
We get rid of the word purity and words like it because they are unnecessary and damaging. And we talk about things like compassion, and that's how we do it. Because there's some good stuff, but there's some vocab that just does not provide a service to us any longer. I just think we have to completely shift gears and we axe the words that are coming along for this new ride.
Yeah, but then
Except for scientific research. They have to have pure science.
Sure. Oh.
That, they.
the new 7 words that we can't say.
I think we look at,
No, the new ones are
Purity.
like vagina,
you know,
vagina.
if you're looking at purity for examples, it's like scientific research is something that is like unblemished, like 100% whatever it is you're looking for. That's purity there.
But I think what
And-
she's relating to
Like,
is
can I
like,
finish?
yeah, like you were done.
No, rare. Anyway,
It is good.
Mean girls.
so
Oh dear, I'm listening over here.
I'm listening.
I have to.
but I think that ultimately, whereas yes, we in terms of people think, and I think society as a whole has made it purity. It is about that, like that almost everything to do with like sexual stuff.
Wait, say that again?
Purity, the way society
Oh,
now began to describe people, it is hung up on sexuality or like abstinence, like whatever else. But I think of purity in terms of people. For me, anyway, it's internal. It's what's in your heart, and that I think goes back to the reading talking about helping the widows and orphans. And that ultimately is that purity has to be more spiritual and in you that kind of like what last week we were talking about, what is holiness? That purity in that sense too is, are you following these? Are you being kind? Are you being compassionate, loving? That's the thing. So for me, yes, that's the society uses it. That's just kind of like what I think of.
Mm-hmm. So,
There's too much perfectionism inherent in purity. Like perfectionism is kind of demanded with that word, and that's not helpful either. I mean, it doesn't talk about a path where we grow from mistakes. And then you were talking about, we need like an agent of the Lord to get us there. We can't do it internally with this, so it's extremely problematic on a few levels. Because I think we can get there ourselves or with like a kindred community to support us. And I think that mistakes should be welcomed and learned from. And then I just think purity is kind of obsolete at this point, the idea of it.
which soap was 99 and 44/100% pure? Was it Ivory?
Maybe.
There was a bar of soap that floated back in the day, and I remember as a kid, I think it was in Cub Scouts. So we took this bar of soap and then we cut out turned it into a boat. We shaved off the corners on one end and gave it a point,
Yes, I've heard.
hollowed out the inside and stuck. Do you know what I just found out? They tried to tell us that floated because it was pure. It floated because they had injected a ton of air into the soap. So the purity, you might say, was just a bunch of hot air they shoved in there. I mean, it was so pure they lied to us about how pure it was, blew it up with air and told us it floated because it was pure. Isn't that what it is? And there's this other unfortunate thing. You see I want to say patriotism. That's not the word I want. Patriarchy is replete. The stuff is replete with it because most of the criteria are, by virtue of their nature, impossible to apply to males.
That's, you know, when you talk about like temple, like period, like the ritual cleanliness, looking at the way women were not allowed in, like, while they had their period or like after, like they had to go through this whole ritual cleansing.
Yeah.
And it's like they were so hung up on that they weren't worthy to be in the temple, but it's like, that's God's gift if women are going to be the ones to have children.
Is that why you say my friend's coming to town?
Yeah, friends, no, that's what say friends visiting.
No, but you know, but it just, I mean, seriously, you know, I just thought it was ironic that God designed women to have children, and that was part of it. So how is that unclean if that's what God designed?
Right. But of course they had no idea
Yeah.
how reproduction works. They thought, you know, that women were basically an incubator and all the active components of reproduction were within the male. So the real, you know, we just deigned to deposit our seed, which then only needed to be kept warm by y'all until for life to spring forth. And so they didn't connect. All they knew was they looked at animals and said when they bleed out, they die, so life must be in blood. And blood's coming out of women once a month. That's pretty.
7 days of 55.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and what? So you know, it's okay for their time. Okay, that was the best they could do.
They still do it.
Well, exactly. Why don't we let go of that? Why can't we integrate the things we've learned, especially scientifically?
What?
Especially scientifically, integrate the things we've learned, stack it up against our beliefs and say, well, you know, this was okay for them because that's all they knew. I mean, maybe they weren't ill-motivated. You know, maybe the Pope said you got to eat fish on Friday because the fishmongers in Rome worked out a deal with it.
Yeah.
You know, and if Sam Elliott had been the Pope, it would be beef that we'd have to eat on Fridays, which was for dinner. You know, so why do you think people are reluctant to let go of that?
I think maybe the same reason that they're reluctant to let go of so many things. You know, like you see, especially like the fundamentalists and everything else that are so hung up on the way things were, you know, 200 whatever years ago or like more. You know, but in terms of like our own country, look back the way the churches were when we were, you know, Puritans, you know, essentially, and then you know, still sticking to it if you don't. But it becomes what they know, and I think a lot of times, you know, for humans, so a lot of times it challenges what we know or what we've grown up with. It can be scary, and it's easier to just kind of stick your head in the sand and stay where you're comfortable and not try to break outside of that. I think maybe that's what happens.
And-
Just don't let go of it because it's scary.
And as you're saying that, I'm thinking of last week where we talked about orthodoxy versus orthopraxis in terms of holiness. And if you're orthodoxy, then your beliefs are untouchable. If you're orthopraxy, those beliefs are likely to make you uncomfortable.
People really are, I'm like, oh, I think I might have forgotten every single thing else, but people romanticize tradition. And, you know, like Christmas or whatever, you can take or leave things. It can be like, you know, a buffet where you select, but I think some people are like, well, no, if I go to the buffet, I have to have a little bit of everything, and if I skip something, then it's not the same and it's not right. And, you know, I think that's kind of part of it. It's so, well, this is what I grew up with, and this is what we did, this is what we always did, so I have to do all of it, every single thing, or otherwise it's not the same. And maybe it's okay if it's not maybe we can keep what works and what does, feel like that good nostalgia, as long as it's not damaging to anyone, and stuff that doesn't make sense anymore, we scrap it. People are just afraid to scrap any of it. Like if I get rid of that, then pretty soon it's all going away, and that's.
Helen A. this.
Yeah, that's not really how it has to work.
Yaroslav Pelikan.
What?
Yaroslav Pelikan, who was a pretty well-known Protestant theologian of the last century, said that tradition is the living faith of dead people. But traditionalism, which is what you were talking about, is the dead faith of living people. And that a tradition can evolve. In fact, it must evolve. But traditionalism says we're going to look back at what we used to do and turn it into some kind of an idol. It is the golden calf. It's always been this way, even though nothing's always been this way. And yeah, the dead faith of living people doesn't last.
Can I relate, what this makes me think of is I stayed with some Orthodox Jewish people that were really good friends with my mom, and this is when I was exploring various religions. I was 14 years old. So I stayed with them for a week, and it just preparing the meals, what can be washed with what when you're done. These plates, the exact same set as those plates with slightly different color or something. These are for meat, these are for dairy. They can't cross.
Yeah.
You have to wash all the dairy dishes first, and then fresh water for anything that had meat.
Life's complicated enough.
I know, and my,
Well, if she could, Erica could attest to if a Jewish person dies on the Sabbath. I'm sorry.
it's okay.
If they have different rules when it comes to that even.
Oh, yes.
Like they couldn't
Oh,
use
she
the
knows all about
elevator.
that.
And we went to the Jewish home, they couldn't use the elevator on some, I don't know what day it is, but where you don't have electricity, you can't use electricity.
Saturday, probably.
Yeah. So, anyway, I'm not.
What'd they
gonna
do,
talk
just
about
bounce
it.
them? They just bounced the dead person down the stairs.
They left. We had to leave him there. I was a nurse for him, and we kept him in the room, and they have to be covered a certain way, and so tell them that the game was over and they could use electricity again. But I learned a lot about different religions as being honest. I'm sure you did.
Oh. Oh. Well, we know you're having a heart attack, and we'd love to counter shock you, but
Yeah, can't use the electricity.
can't use that on Saturday.
Yeah.
You hear about the guy that we just heard on the way here? True story. The question for what do you know is, why did this guy fake a heart attack?
You did?
Because he wanted the ambulance to take him to the hospital so he could go to the cafeteria. True story.
Seriously?
Yeah.
Oh my god.
I could see.
I heard of people faking an illness. It happened to nurse.
Yeah, this guy was faking it so he could get a ride to the cafeteria. Apparently this hospital has terrible food.
Meet all kinds, eh?
Yeah.
Well, we've come a long way, you know.
True.
Part of that,
Dude, the Catholics always have fish on Friday, so that will remain forever.
especially in Milwaukee,
Yeah, oh yeah.
What's that?
fish fries.
Oh.
Fried fish
Oh,
fries
it's a
for
Wisconsin
Catholics.
thing, man. Up north there is no food served except fish fries.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh,
Nothing
yeah.
else.
Really?
Unbelievable.
I used to work at McDonald's, and Fish Fry Friday was crazy.
Yeah. Oh, during Lent too.
Yeah. And then when do you have to stop eating? When is it? When do you,
Oh, Good Friday, Ash
Friday.
Wednesday.
fast.
Yeah.
I'm having trouble catching words. They're there, but I can't get them out. I can't get back to my brain right. I think I should just shut up.
You're fine.
Not really.
So, some of that you're talking about Judaism and those dietary restrictions. It's sometimes called a faithful remnant kind of theology. Seventh-day Adventists, very much. Mormons, very much. Orthodox Judaism very much, Orthodox Christianity very much. This idea that we are the only ones that are true to the original teachings and therefore the only ones who will receive whatever the reward is. And so if we have to keep 2 sets of dishes, it's a small price to pay. Obviously, that has limited appeal to many of us.
When Jesus came and changed all that, and Jesus came, that doesn't matter what you like in here.
Right.
You could do, it's like the Pharisees.
That doesn't work for Judaism though.
They behave, well, what's that really strong Jewish faith with the,
Yes.
yeah,
The
they're
Hasidic?
on, New York has.
Oh, yeah, that's.
What is
that's
it,
their
they have like
diamonds.
curls here, you know what I'm talking
Yeah,
about?
the 4 locks, so to
I-
speak.
They're actually
Well,
called
that's a
curls.
biblical thing, isn't it, with the,
Biblically, they were used to, well, it was the English.
and they have something hanging down here, I don't think.
Those are the strings from their talent, their prayer shawl that's under the
Oh.
or they're coming unraveled. If you just tug one of them, you can find out. We used to, one quick funny story. We used to have an Orthodox doctor when I worked at Country Memorial, and and he was, and I'm not casting stones at this, but he was a heavier guy, you know, and so like his shirt tail, he had trouble keeping it tucked in, and under his shirt was his callet, so he always had strings hanging out, wore a yarmulke and stuff, and he had a patient on the unit who was oxygen dependent and in a wheelchair, and she went back to use the phone to call home, and she put her feet up on the chair that was there, and when her weight shifted, the weight of the oxygen tank flipped her over on her back, and so she's like a turtle there, and
Oh my God.
and the doctor was on the unit at the time, and he and I went running down there. She looks up at him and goes, "Hey, Jewish man, can you put me back up on my feet?" And I said to him, "You suppose she has X-ray vision?"
Oh.
Anyway.
That was bad.
It was.
You warned us.
Yeah, I did. So, shall we pray about things? On that note? Setting things back up?
Is that like the time you fell over in the chair?
Yeah, very much.
That was hilarious.
Except I didn't look at you and go, "Hey, Jewish woman." Even though I could have in some realities. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Finish.